The engagement ring nearly slipped from Zephyr Vale's hand the moment he heard 7 words that shattered every dream he had spent 3 years building around one woman. I stayed because he was convenient. Convenient. Not loved. Not cherished. Not unforgettable. Convenient. For a few seconds his brain refused to process what he had heard because pain never arrives all at once. Real pain enters slowly. First comes confusion, then disbelief, then denial. Your mind desperately searches for alternate explanations because accepting reality immediately would destroy you too quickly. Zephyr stopped breathing. The bouquet of deep red roses in his left hand suddenly felt heavy. The velvet ring box in his right hand nearly slipped from his fingers. The city light outside Vesper Hall blurred, and parked directly beside the entrance sat a customized pink Mercedes decorated with a giant ribbon and a small white plate that read, "For my love." Her dream car. Not because it cost money, not because it was luxurious, because 9 months earlier during traffic she had pointed toward a pink Mercedes driving across Michigan Avenue and smiled. If I ever owned one, Serafina had laughed, I'd want pink. Zephyr smiled back then. What? Pink? Yes. You're serious? Absolutely. Why? She laughed, because life becomes boring when everything tries too hard to look important. He remembered every word. Every word. That was his problem. Zephyr remembered everything. Tiny details. Tiny moments. Tiny expressions. Because people who spend years feeling emotionally alone become students of affection. They learn to treasure details others forget. Small gestures become evidence. Evidence becomes hope. Hope becomes attachment. 3 years earlier, Zephyr Vale had everything people thought should create happiness. Money, success, luxury, companies, investments, recognition. But every night he returned home to silence, and silence becomes dangerous after enough years, because loneliness never attacks dramatically. It whispers, slowly, quietly. Loneliness convinces intelligent people to tolerate things they normally would reject. It lowers standards. It disguises emotional hunger as love. People often mistake attention for connection, and people terrified of losing someone become experts at ignoring warning signs. Zephyr understood that now, but understanding often arrives after damage, not before. 3 years earlier, rain covered downtown Chicago. Zephyr entered a bookstore cafe searching for somewhere dry. That was where he met Serafina Vorse. Near the windows. Blue sweater. Black jeans. Coffee untouched. Book half open. Rain behind her. She looked up. Smiled. And Zephyr still remembered that smile. Because some moments feel strange immediately. Not magical. Not cinematic. Just strangely important. He almost walked away. Almost. Instead he ordered coffee. Sat nearby, started a conversation. 1 conversation became 3 hours. 3 hours became dinner. Dinner became dates. Dates became years. And years slowly became certainty. Sunday breakfast. Movie nights. Long drives. Vacation traditions. Late night conversations. Tiny routines. Tiny rituals. People underestimate routines. Routines create emotional gravity. You stop evaluating people objectively. You stop asking difficult questions. Because consistency creates safety. And safety creates assumptions. Zephyr assumed Serafina loved him. He never questioned it. Never. Months earlier he secretly planned tonight. Everything. Every detail. Everything. The proposal. The flowers. Private dining reservations. Musicians. Candles. Customized gifts. And the Mercedes. The ridiculous pink Mercedes. Hours earlier he walked around it smiling like an idiot. Smiling alone. Like a teenager. Because love does that. Love temporarily lowers intelligence. That truth hurts people. But it remains true. Emotions amplify blind spots. That lesson appears everywhere. Relationships. Friendships. Business. People make terrible decisions when emotions become stronger than observation. Hours earlier, Alaric Thorne called. Alaric was among the few people Zephyr genuinely respected. Older, disciplined, calm, a billionaire investor with a strange ability to understand human behavior within minutes. He often said business was simple. People were difficult. Zephyr remembered laughing. Today's the day. Silence. Then Alaric asked, "You sound nervous." Zephyr smiled. "I am nervous." "Good." Zephyr frowned. "Good." "Yes." Silence. Then. "Fear before major decisions means your mind understands consequences." Zephyr laughed. "That sounds depressing." "No." Silence. Long silence. Then Alaric spoke softly. "Zephyr." "Yeah?" "Love deeply. Pause. But never lose your ability to observe." Zephyr laughed. "She's different." Silence. Nothing. At the time, Alaric's silence meant nothing. Now it haunted him. Because standing outside Vesper Hall, memories suddenly returned. "Questions?" Serafina asked. Questions that felt harmless before. Questions involving investments. Questions involving trusts. Questions involving ownership. Questions about business structures. Questions about inheritance. Questions disguised as curiosity. At the time, he felt appreciated. Now something inside him felt uncomfortable. Inside the private dining room, Callista Arden laughed. Zephyr immediately felt irritation. Callista. Even hearing her name annoyed him. Not because she openly hated him, because she felt calculated. Some people smile with warmth. Others smile while evaluating opportunity. Callista belonged in the second category. Serafina always defended her. She's misunderstood. She's protective. She's just careful. Excuses. Love creates talented excuse makers. Inside the room, Callista laughed again. "You're terrible." Serafina laughed. "No." "Yes." "No." More laughter. Then Callista said, "You really have him wrapped around your finger." Silence. Then Serafina answered, "You should see him." Callista laughed harder. "The flowers." "Yes." "The proposal." "Yes." "The pink Mercedes." Serafina laughed. "Yes." Zephyr froze. Something felt wrong. Not words. Tone. People reveal truth through tone before words expose intentions. No warmth. No affection. No softness. Nothing. Callista lowered her voice. "Okay, seriously." Silence. Then. "Do you actually love him?" Everything stopped. Everything. "No. No. No. Please. Please. No." Inside the room, Serafina exhaled slowly, then finally said, "You want the truth?" Callista leaned forward. "Obviously." Silence. Long silence. Zephyr felt his heartbeat inside his throat. Then Serafina whispered, "I stayed because of who Zephyr really is." Confusion immediately replaced pain. Who he really is. What did that mean? Callista froze. "What?" Serafina looked toward the window, smiled slightly, then lowered her voice. "So, 2 years ago I found something." Silence. Callista stared. Zephyr stared. "What?" Another pause. Then Serafina smiled, and Zephyr felt his entire body go cold, because her next sentence destroyed him. Zephyr Vale isn't the man he pretends to be. Callista blinked twice. What does that even mean? Serafina leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. For a moment she stared through the restaurant windows toward the afternoon traffic outside, toward the people walking past, toward the pink Mercedes waiting beside the entrance, toward the future Zephyr thought belonged to both of them. Then she smiled. Not warmly, not lovingly. The kind of smile people make when they believe they know something powerful. "You remember my cousin Rowan?" Callista frowned. "The finance guy." "Yes." "The one who investigates corporate acquisitions." Serafina nodded slowly. Zephyr felt a strange pressure form in his chest. Corporate investigations. Finance. Acquisitions. Suddenly his heartbeat grew heavier. Because 2 years ago one of Zephyr's companies quietly acquired several tech firms through private holding structures. Very few people understood how much Zephyr actually owned. He preferred that. Money attracts admiration. Real wealth attracts strategy. And strategy attracts dangerous people. Years earlier, Alaric had warned him. Not dramatically, not like movies. Just during dinner one evening, they sat overlooking Lake Michigan while city lights reflected against black water. Alaric looked at him and said, "The higher people climb, the more carefully they must observe intentions." Zephyr laughed. You think everyone wants something? No. Alaric took a sip of coffee. Just enough people. Then he continued, never assume affection and access mean the same thing. At the time, Zephyr misunderstood him. Now those words returned like ghosts. Inside the room, Callista leaned forward. What are you saying? Serafina lowered her voice. Rowan found documents. Silence. Zephyr felt his pulse accelerate. No. 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 Please. No. Not this. Callista stared. What documents? Serafina smiled. The Zephyr veil everyone sees. Pause. Isn't even close to reality. Zephyr suddenly remembered strange moments from the last year. Serafina becoming unusually interested whenever business channels discussed acquisitions. Questions about executive partnerships. Questions about company ownership. Questions about trusts. Questions about inheritance structures. At the time they felt random. Now they felt organized. Carefully organized. His stomach tightened. Because painful realizations never happen instantly. They stack. One memory, then another, until eventually, denial runs out of places to hide. Inside the restaurant, Callista whispered, Wait. Long pause. Then, you mean she stayed because he's rich? Serafina immediately laughed. And somehow that hurt more, because it wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't uncomfortable laughter. It was confident, almost offended. No. Silence. Then she smiled. Much richer. Zephyr stopped breathing. Outside, city light reflected against the pink Mercedes. The flowers in his hands suddenly felt heavier than stone. And for the first time all afternoon, he no longer wanted to walk inside. Zephyr stopped breathing. Outside, city light reflected against the pink Mercedes. The bouquet in his left hand suddenly felt heavier than stone. The ring box in his right hand no longer felt like a symbol of hope. It felt like evidence. Evidence that a man deeply in love can spend years building a future with someone while missing the truth. Standing directly in front of him, inside the private dining room, Callista stared at Serafina. Wait. Silence. What do you mean much richer? Serafina leaned back slowly. For the first time since Zephyr had started listening, she looked completely relaxed. No hesitation. No guilt. No fear. Just confidence. And confidence becomes terrifying when people believe they already won. Serafina picked up her glass and looked toward the restaurant windows. You know what the funny thing is? Callista said nothing. Serafina smiled. He thinks I fell in love with him. The words entered Zephyr's chest like ice. Not because of anger, because of humiliation. There is a unique pain attached to realizing someone experienced the same relationship completely, differently than you did. Zephyr remembered every anniversary, every late-night drive, every birthday, every tiny surprise, every moment he believed meant something. And suddenly a terrible question entered his mind. What if none of it was real? People rarely discuss emotional shock honestly. Movies show screaming, crying, chaos. Reality feels different. Reality feels quiet. Quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. Quiet enough to hear your own thoughts betray you. No. No. Maybe there's context. Maybe there's another explanation. Maybe. Then Callista spoke. You knew before dating him. Silence. Serafina looked down, then smiled. Not immediately. Zephyr froze. Callista leaned closer. How long? Another pause. Then, 7 months. Everything stopped. 7 months. 7 months. Zephyr felt cold spread through his chest. 7 months after meeting him. 7 months after movie nights. 7 months after road trips. 7 months after he introduced her to parts of himself nobody else had seen. 7 months. Inside, Callista looked stunned. You're serious? Serafina nodded. Rowan accidentally discovered one of Zephyr's holding companies. Silence. Callista stared. The tech companies? Serafina nodded. Then he kept digging. Zephyr's breathing became shallow, because suddenly he understood. Rowan. He remembered Rowan. Quiet. Observant. Sharp eyes. Always asking strangely specific business questions during family dinners. Questions Zephyr barely noticed. Questions, he answered carelessly. Not because he trusted Rowan, because he trusted Serafina. Huge difference. People often think betrayal begins when someone lies. It doesn't. Betrayal often begins earlier. Betrayal begins when trust removes caution. Inside, Callista whispered, "Oh my God." Serafina shrugged. He found ownership structures. Silence. Callista stared. And Zephyr never knew. Serafina laughed softly. No. No. That one word hurt more than anything, because of how casually she said it. No guilt. No remorse. Nothing. Outside the restaurant, Zephyr stared at the flowers in his hand. Red roses. Her favorite. 6 florists. 3 redesigns. Hours spent choosing details. And suddenly, he remembered something strange. 8 months ago, Serafina suddenly became interested in prenuptial agreements. At the time, she disguised it as curiosity. "What do you think about prenups?" Zephyr remembered laughing. Random question. She shrugged. "Not really." Then, "Would you ever ask me to sign one?" At the time, he smiled. No. He remembered her face afterward. Relief. Actual relief. Back then it looked sweet. Now it looked terrifying. Because manipulation becomes obvious only after awareness arrives. That's the cruel thing about emotional intelligence. You usually gain it after pain. Not before. Inside, Callista stared. So what was the plan? Silence. Serafina looked toward the window. Toward the pink Mercedes. Toward the future Zephyr had built for her. Then quietly, "I didn't know at first." Pause. Then, but eventually. Long pause. "I realized opportunities like Zephyr don't appear twice. Opportunities, not love. Opportunities." Zephyr closed his eyes. Because words reveal priorities. Always. Inside, Callista whispered, "You stayed because of money." Serafina immediately shook her head. No. Silence. Then she lowered her voice. "Not money." Pause. "Security. Security." Amazing how people rename things to protect themselves. Greed becomes stability. Manipulation becomes practicality. Self-interest becomes survival. Human beings are incredibly talented at rewriting motivations. Inside the room, Serafina continued, "You know my childhood." Callista nodded. "My father left. My mother struggled. We lost everything." Silence. "I promised myself I'd never live like that again." Callista remained quiet. Then, "So you loved him eventually?" Long silence. Long enough for Zephyr's heart to start hoping. Dangerous thing, hope. Even during heartbreak, people search for rescue. Search for reasons. Search for evidence. Inside the room, Serafina finally answered, and Zephyr wished she hadn't. "I care about him." Silence. "But love?" Long pause. Then she shrugged. "I don't know." Outside, Zephyr felt his chest collapse. Because uncertainty hurts more than rejection. Rejection ends things. Uncertainty leaves room for torture. Inside, Callista stared. "You're still marrying him?" Serafina looked confused. "Of course." "Even now?" "Yes." "Why?" Silence. Then Serafina smiled. Because sometimes one expression tells the entire truth before words arrive. Then. Because men like Zephyr only appear once. Silence. Callista looked down. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Actually uncomfortable. Then quietly, "You're scaring me." Serafina frowned. "What?" Callista looked toward the table. Toward the candles. Toward the flowers. Toward the engagement waiting only feet away. Then, "I thought you loved him." Silence. Long silence. For several seconds, Serafina said nothing. Then quietly, "I thought so too." Zephyr froze. "Wait. What?" Inside, Serafina looked away. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. Tiny. But real. Then she whispered, "Maybe I did." Silence. Callista stared. "What does that mean?" Serafina looked toward the window. Toward city light. Toward the street. Toward the pink Mercedes. Then quietly, "Things got complicated after Rowan showed me something last month." Zephyr felt his heartbeat stop. "Last month?" Callista frowned. "What?" Long silence. Then, "A document." "What document?" Serafina looked down. And suddenly, all warmth disappeared from her face. Every trace. Then she whispered, "A succession file." Silence. Callista blinked. "What?" Serafina looked directly at her, and spoke words that made Zephyr's blood run cold. "Zephyr isn't just wealthy." Pause. Long pause. Then, he's worth far more than anyone knows. Silence. Callista stared. Outside, Zephyr stood frozen. Then Serafina leaned closer and whispered, "And if what Rowan found is true..." Long pause. "Zephyr Vale may secretly own something worth billions even he doesn't know exists." Zephyr Vale didn't remember dropping the roses. He only remembered hearing the sound. Soft. Almost insignificant. Yet somehow louder than everything else. Red petals scattered across the pavement beneath the night while people walked past. Vesper Hall without. Noticing that a man's entire reality had just collapsed beside them. Because heartbreak rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most people imagine destruction as screaming, crying, chaos. But real emotional collapse often looks ordinary. A person becomes quiet, still, frozen. And that terrified Zephyr, because he had experienced financial losses before. Business failures, partnership collapses, lawsuits. Millions gained, millions lost. But money had rules. People didn't. And standing outside that restaurant, Zephyr realized something painful. You can analyze markets, you can study industries, you can predict trends, but feelings mixed with loneliness create blind spots no intelligence can fully protect against. Inside the restaurant, chairs moved softly, glasses touched. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. Meanwhile, Zephyr felt like the world had tilted sideways, because Seraphine's words kept replaying. Security, opportunity, much richer, billions. Every sentence returned. Again, again, again. Then another memory surfaced. 1 year earlier, Saturday night. Rain outside. Serafina sitting beside him in his penthouse while watching a movie. Halfway through, she muted the television. "Can I ask something?" Zephyr remembered smiling. "Of course." Silence. Then, "If something happened to you, who controls everything?" Back then he laughed. "Everything." She smiled. "You know what I mean." He remembered kissing her forehead. Random question. Then he answered. "Because people in love answer questions, even when they should not." Now standing outside Vesper Hall, Zephyr closed his eyes. Because pain changes memory. Moments once viewed as sweet suddenly become suspicious. Questions become investigations. Affection becomes strategy. And trust becomes evidence. The worst part wasn't realizing Serafina may have manipulated him. The worst part was realizing how many opportunities he gave her. Because manipulation rarely succeeds through intelligence alone. It succeeds through access. And access requires trust. Zephyr slowly sat inside his car. Not the Mercedes. His own black Aston Martin parked farther down the street. His hands trembled. Not dramatically. Barely. But enough. Enough to scare him. He stared forward. Traffic moved. People crossed streets. Life continued. Strange. The world never pauses for personal disasters. Your heart can break at 3:17 p.m. and by 3:18. Someone nearby is laughing over coffee.com. Someone gets promoted. Someone buys flowers. Someone falls in love. The world keeps moving. Zephyr stared at his phone. 32 unread messages. Most business-related. One from Serafina. Earlier. Hours earlier. Her message read, "Can't wait tonight." He stared at it. Long. Very long. Then locked his phone, because suddenly he remembered Alaric. Alaric Thorne. The one man who somehow always saw things others missed. The one man who once said, "People reveal themselves through patterns, not moments." Back then, Zephyr barely understood what he meant. Today, those words felt different. Pattern. 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 Questions. Behavior. Timing. Interest. Relief. Suddenly, Zephyr started remembering everything. Not emotionally. Analytically. Like assembling pieces. Months earlier, Serafina unexpectedly asked about his family trust. 5 months ago, she became curious about succession structures. 8 months ago, she asked whether hidden ownership assets could exist. 3 weeks ago, she asked if people sometimes inherit things they never knew about. At the time, he laughed. Now he felt sick. Because isolated moments look harmless. Patterns tell stories. And emotional intelligence often begins there. Noticing repeated behavior. Recognizing consistency. Understanding motives. Loneliness makes people focus on feelings. Wisdom forces people to examine patterns. Zephyr started the engine, then stopped. No destination. No plan. Nothing. His phone suddenly rang. Alaric. Silence. Zephyr stared. Then answered. Hello? No response. Then. You sound different. Zephyr swallowed. What? Alaric remained silent. Long silence. Then. What happened? Zephyr stared through the windshield. People moved outside. Cars passed. Everything normal. Everything broken. Finally he spoke. I think. Silence. Then. I think I made a mistake. Long pause. Alaric said nothing. Not immediately. Because wise people understand something. People reveal more when silence exists. Eventually Zephyr laughed. Small laugh. Broken laugh. Actually. Pause. No. Another pause. Then. I know I made a mistake. Silence. Alaric spoke softly. Where are you? Outside Vesper Hall. Long pause. The proposal. Zephyr looked toward the restaurant. Toward the pink Mercedes. Toward flowers still scattered on pavement. Then. No proposal. Silence. What happened? Zephyr closed his eyes. Then told him everything. Everything. The conversation. The documents. Rowan. Security. Opportunity. Billions. All of it. Silence followed. Long silence. Long enough for Zephyr to become uncomfortable. Then Alaric quietly asked, Do you want honesty? Zephyr laughed. What else is left? Silence. Then. Pain creates two kinds of people. Zephyr stared forward. Alaric continued. The first becomes emotional. Pause. The second becomes observant. Silence. Then. Choose carefully. Zephyr frowned. What does that mean? Alaric exhaled. It means hurt people often rush toward conclusions. Pause. Anger. Pause. Revenge. Pause. Impulsive decisions. Silence. Then. Never make permanent choices while experiencing temporary emotional collapse. Zephyr said nothing. Because deep down, he knew Alaric was right. Emotional intelligence isn't suppressing feelings. It's recognizing feelings without allowing them to drive decisions. And loneliness creates dangerous urgency. People afraid of losing someone rush toward answers. Rush toward confrontation. Rush toward reactions. Zephyr almost walked back inside. Almost. But Alaric spoke again. Come see me. Silence. What? Now. Alaric. Now. 35 minutes later Zephyr sat inside. Alaric's office overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Quiet jazz music. Bookshelves. City light. Normal. Calm. The opposite of Zephyr's mind. Alaric sat across from him. Silent. Watching. Observing. 10 full seconds passed. Then. You still love her. Not question. Statement. Zephyr looked away. Silence. Then. I don't know. Alaric nodded. Because uncertainty told him enough. Then he leaned forward and said something Zephyr would remember forever. Loneliness makes people fall in love with potential. Silence. Then. But self-respect begins when reality becomes more important than fantasy. Silence filled the office. Then Alaric opened a file. Slowly, placed it on the desk, and Zephyr suddenly frowned. Because written across the front were 4 words. Vale Family Succession Archives. Then Alaric looked directly at him, and quietly said, There's something about your father you were never told. Zephyr stared at the file without blinking. Vale Family Succession Archives. The words sat on Alaric Thorne's desk like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago moved normally beneath the evening sky. Traffic crawled through intersections. Office lights flickered on. People walked home carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that Zephyr Vale felt like his entire identity had shattered twice in one afternoon. First Serafina. Now this. Silence filled the office. Long silence. The kind that becomes louder with every second. Zephyr looked up slowly. What is this? Alaric folded his hands. For several moments he said nothing. Because timing matters. Information delivered at the wrong emotional moment becomes noise. Then he spoke quietly. 3 months ago, I was contacted by an international legal firm. Zephyr frowned. What does that have to do with me? Silence. Alaric slid the file forward. Open it. Zephyr stared. Didn't move. Then slowly reached forward, opened the folder, and immediately froze. Photos. Old documents. Letters. Signatures. Names. Family records. Inheritance structures. His heartbeat slowed, not because he felt calm, because shock changes rhythm. His eyes moved lower, then stopped. One name. Cassian Vale. Silence. Zephyr stared. Again. Cassian Vale. His father. No. Not possible. No. Zephyr looked up immediately. My father died when I was 12. Alaric said nothing. Zephyr's chest tightened. My father worked at a manufacturing plant. Silence. Then. That's what your mother believed. Everything stopped. No. 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 Zephyr stared at him. Alaric looked directly back. No expression. No drama. Only truth. Because truth never needs performance. Truth survives without volume. Zephyr laughed. Small laugh. Confused laugh. No. Silence. Then louder. No. Alaric still didn't move. Finally. Cassian Vale lived 2 lives. Silence. A public life. Pause. And another life almost nobody knew existed. Zephyr stared. Alaric opened another document. More files. More records. Then. Your father quietly invested in technology firms 25 years ago. Silence. Extremely early. Pause. Extremely successfully. Zephyr blinked. Nothing. His brain felt slow. Very slow. Because emotional exhaustion has limits. There comes a point where the mind simply stops accepting information. Alaric continued. He built ownership structures through private entities. Silence. Hidden holdings. Pause. Protected succession systems. Then. And before dying, he created conditions that delayed ownership transfer. Silence. Zephyr stared. What? Alaric looked directly at him. You. Pause. You were the final beneficiary. Nothing moved. Nothing. The office disappeared. Sound disappeared. Everything disappeared except one sentence. You were the final beneficiary, because suddenly memories returned. His mother working extra shifts. Bills. Stress. Tiny apartments. Second-hand furniture. Years struggling. Years. Years. And now this? Zephyr whispered. No. Alaric remained calm. Very few people knew. Silence. Then. I didn't know either until recently. Zephyr stood immediately. Walked toward the windows. Stopped. Turned. No. Long pause. Then. How much? Silence. Alaric looked down. Then back up. Long pause. Very long pause. Then quietly. Estimated value? Silence. Several billion. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Zephyr stared. Not because of excitement. Not because of wealth. Because of timing. Because suddenly Seraphine's words returned. Security. Opportunity. Much richer. Billions. Billions. His stomach dropped. Because suddenly one terrifying question appeared. Did she know? No. Worse. How much did she know? Zephyr looked toward Alaric. When? Silence. Then. When did Rowan access this? Alaric looked confused. What? Zephyr stepped forward. When? Pause. Did Rowan access this? Alaric stared. Then slowly. About 6 weeks ago, everything stopped. 6 weeks. Zephyr looked down. 6 weeks earlier, Seraphina suddenly asked strange questions. 6 weeks earlier, she became unusually affectionate. 6 weeks earlier, she started discussing marriage more often. 6 weeks. Silence filled the room. Then Alaric quietly asked, What are you thinking? Zephyr laughed. Broken laugh. Then. I think. Silence. Then. No. Another silence. Then. I know. He looked toward the city. Toward thousands of lights. Then whispered. She found out. Silence. Alaric said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Sometimes pain becomes obvious. Then Zephyr suddenly remembered something. Callista. Her face. Her discomfort. Wait. He turned. Fast. Too fast. Callista. Alaric frowned. What? Zephyr stared. Something was wrong. Silence. She looked uncomfortable. Pause. Scared. He thought back. Every expression. Every reaction. Every moment. Then realization arrived. Callista wasn't reacting like someone hearing a plan. She was reacting like someone discovering truth. Huge difference. Zephyr grabbed his phone. Immediately. Messages. Contacts. Callista Arden. Call. Ring. 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 Answer. Silence. Then. Hello? Zephyr spoke immediately. Tell me the truth. Silence. Nothing. Then. What? The restaurant. Silence. Long silence. Then. Breathing. Nervous breathing. Then. Oh God. Zephyr closed his eyes. Because he knew. Immediately. He knew. Callista whispered. Oh God, Zephyr. Silence. Then. You heard. Not question. Statement. Zephyr said nothing. Callista started crying. Actual crying. Then. I tried. Silence. I swear I tried. Zephyr froze. What? I told her she was wrong. Pause. I told her. Silence. Then. She changed after Rowan. Long pause. She became obsessed. Silence. Not with money. Pause. With fear. Zephyr frowned. What? Callista cried harder. She thought if she lost you. Pause. She'd lose safety. Silence. She started convincing herself security and love were the same thing. Nothing. Zephyr said nothing. Because suddenly something Alaric said returned. Pain creates emotional people. Or observant people. Then Callista whispered something else. Something unexpected. Something that changed everything. She loved you before. Silence. Zephyr froze. What? She really did. Pause. Before Rowan. Long silence. Then. After learning about everything. Pause. Fear changed her. Silence. Because fear changes people too. Not just greed. Not just manipulation. Fear. Fear of poverty. Fear of abandonment. Fear of returning to pain. People do terrible things trying to avoid old wounds. Not because they're evil, because they're terrified. And suddenly, Zephyr understood something painful. Serafina didn't destroy love. Fear did. Silence filled the office. Long silence. Then Alaric quietly spoke. Now decide. Zephyr looked up. Silence. Then. Emotion? Pause. Or observation? Long silence. Very long silence. Then Zephyr smiled. Small smile. Sad smile. Then reached into his pocket. Pulled out the ring. Looked at it. Stared. Then placed it on Alaric's desk. Silence. I'm choosing self-respect. Months later, Zephyr stood on a rooftop overlooking Chicago. Wind moved through the evening air. Peacefully. Quietly. No pink Mercedes. No flowers. No performance. Just peace. Because healing rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly. Like truth. Like wisdom. Like acceptance. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. One message. Serafina. 3